Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I am Charlene O'Hanlon, the moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a very informative, very exciting webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, please know you'll be able to listen to it on demand. Following the webinar today, we will be sending out an email that will include a link to take you to the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time today you have a question for our panelists, don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll take probably around 10 minutes or so near the end of the presentation and go over the audience questions. Okay, with that, I would like to go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is the Accelerate 2018 State of DevOps Report, Strategies for a New Economy. Our speakers today are two very highly renowned folks in the industry. Our first speaker needs no introduction. He is Gene Kim, author, researcher, and founder of IT Revolution. And our other speaker today is Ben Newton, Director of Product Marketing at Sumo Logic. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
All right, great. So Ben, I don't know if you have your slide ready. You can go ahead and advance them, but I will put myself on mute and let you get to it.
Great. Ben, by the way, we've known each other for so many years. Great to be doing this with you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Since the dawn of DevOps, is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, maybe not really. When it first started, people started talking about it. Yeah. So before we get started, I want to do a little intro for those of you who are not really familiar with Sumo Logic. So, one thing when I put these numbers up here, one thing I wanted to make a point is that Sumo Logic is a company that believes in DevOps. It's something that we practice every day, and we built a cloud native microservices application that is what we actually need to serve our customers every single day. Our customers send us we have thousands of customers across the world that are sending us massive amounts of data that's being collected from an enormous number of collectors, which are actually running in their environments and running on AWS, Azure, GCP, all sorts of different data, and then they're analyzing that in millions of different ways every single day. And to do that, we actually have to practice a lot of the things that Gene's going to be talking about today. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited to be able to sponsor this report and be part of this discussion, because it's so important for what we do, because our customers depend on us. They depend on us to be able to run their applications, to be able to protect their data, and we couldn't give them the level of service they expect if we didn't take this kind of thing very, very seriously and try to do the most we can to run an extremely scalable and very effective team. So, fundamentally, what we do is we take in all the data about your application, and we allow you to basically get insights out of that data. So we're a cloud native service, like I said. We've been around for about a decade, and we really focus on three big things that we can do for our customers. One is improving app performance. We're actually going to touch on that a little bit later as well, but being able to take in all that data about your application, no matter where it's running, and being able to help you understand where there might be issues, understand your SLAs, your SLOs, be able to track those, and then be able to quickly solve problems when they come up. We also help you ensure the security of your application and make sure that you're compliant with standards like PCI and HIPAA and so forth. And we allowing you to fix those problems, security issues, very, very quickly, because of course it takes years and years to gain the trust of your customers. It only takes a few minutes to lose it. So we help our customers solve and get ahead of those issues really quickly with things like built-in threat detection and very complex and efficient security forensics. So as well, finally, you can actually optimize the app experience as well. So one of the things I see a lot with our customers is they're actually advancing in a journey like we're talking about today, with DevOps and Agile, one of the things they really want to start doing is feeding in better information to their engineering teams, to their product management teams, to understand what their customers are doing and how to improve the experience for their customers. And to do that, you need data. And so that's one of the things as a former product manager, that's something I spend a lot of time doing, is trying to understand how my customers are using my product and then taking that data and funneling that into my engineering team so they can make better use of the data, and so that they could improve the experience for our customers. And again, we do that for a lot of companies on the right that I'm sure you recognize. So with that, I want to get right into what we're talking about today. So Gene, why don't you kick off the next part here?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so I'm so pleased to share with everyone the findings from the 2018 State of DevOps report. So just a couple of things on the State of DevOps report. This is now year 5 of the research of really understanding what do high performers look like and what are the specific behaviors, technical practices, architectural practices, leadership practices that predict performance. Over the years, the findings have now included over 30,000 respondents, and so we use techniques including cross-population studies. So this is the same type of technique that was used to understand the link between smoking and early morbidity. So it's just so great to be able to understand better than ever what creates great technology organizations. And so this is the 2018 study. So on the next slide, we have, okay, so let's go through the key themes. One of them is that we broadened our notion of IT performance to include availability. So now we call that software delivery and operational performance. So we have a slightly different lens on our view of what creates great technology organization, or what are the outcomes that that frame what great IT organizations look like. On the next slide, we have a couple additional areas of research. One was monitoring observability, and as Ben framed so well, I mean, it's so critical, to be able to see what you're doing when you're delivering software to customers. And so we split that into both monitoring and kind of this nascent term of observability. We expanded the look at continuous testing, on how we manage databases, and how we shift left on security, further left into the software development lifecycle. On the next slide, we talk about the key themes. Oh yes, for our leadership, specifically on how culture affects performance. And we looked at specific areas around what are the behaviors that result in a sense of teams feeling that they have genuine autonomy and trust, not in just the system, but in leadership, and other things that result in the outcomes of a culture of continuous learning, specifically through kind of the retrospectives as framed by the Agile community. So those are some of the objectives that we went into. So here are the findings. This is what we call in fact, internally for 5 years, we've called these the boom statistics, right? It's like, to what extent are high performers outperforming the non-high performing peers? So just let's do the readout. It's we find that high performers are deploying 46 times more frequently. So that could be the application code or changes to the environment. And when they do deployments, they can complete those deployments 2,500 times more quickly. In other words, how quickly can we go from code committed through integration, through testing, through deployment, so that customers are actually getting value? We know that high performers are 7 times less likely to have those deployments result in something bad, whether that's a Sub1 outage, a service impairment, a security breach, or a compliance failure. And when bad things happen, they can fix them 2,600 times more quickly. So on the next slide, you can see how these numbers have changed over time. And so you can find this in the full report. But oops, you know what? Can we go to Ben? Can we go to slide 16? This is actually my favorite view of the slides. On slide 16, what it shows is each one of those 4 metrics. 16, Ben. So if you can click right 5 times. There we go. Good, good, good. Thank you. 16. The slide number is on the lower left-hand corner. it says new 2018 performance metrics. Yeah, thank you so much. So for each one of these metrics, it shows what the performance profile is. And this is actually my favorite way of viewing this. In other words, if you know that the high performers, the elite performers, they're deploying multiple times a day. They can deploy code in less than an hour. When things go wrong, they can typically fix things in 1 hour or less. And about 1 out of 5 or maybe 1 out of 8 changes actually have something go wrong. So I think this is a very convenient way to quickly assess how any organization is doing. Okay, Ben, let's go back to slide 13. Thank you. And my apologies. Yeah.
No, Gene, quick question for you on this slide. Once I actually found it for you, why did you guys decide that you needed to have this new group called Elite? Because you originally only had the 3 high, medium, and low, correct?
Yeah, great question. Let's go to slide 14 and we can talk specifically about that. So the question is a great one, which is why this new category that we've never had before? So in years past, Ben, you're absolutely right. We had high, medium, and low performers. And let me just frame it this way. I mean, I think in this slide, it shows the distribution of the high, medium, and low performers. And something that should really catch your attention is the fact that the high performers now make up nearly half of all respondents. In years past, this number was often between 15 and 20%. So here's my takeaways. One is I think you could have made the case in years past that you didn't need to be a high performer, that mediocrity and mediocreness was just fine because that's where everybody was. And I think if that case was ever valid, I think it is far less valid now, just because what this is showing is that a significant portion of the population, nearly half, is performing at this high performing level. And so we actually looked at a subset of the high performance called elite. So in other words, these are the top 7% within the 48%. And I think this is where we're looking for the the signs of the next levels of greatness being created. I think the other takeaway is this kind of reinforces something I learned from the Software Engineering Institute over 15 years ago. I learned that the high performers are always getting better. They're always accelerating away from the herd, and I think we're absolutely seeing this, in this subset that we're calling the elite performers. Does that resonate with you, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to what you're saying, I mean, we're always innovating, and there's always innovators out there that are pushing the envelope, and you guys are clearly identifying that, which is I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's for 5 years, we always wonder, are we going to learn anything interesting? And it's never failed. There's something so provocative, and this is actually without a doubt, one of my the things I'm most proud of being associated with is this study. So let's go to slide 17. So kind of the other surprises. Another one of them is the notion of cloud. So we asked 5 questions about, are you doing cloud? Well, we first asked, are you, to what extent are you adopting cloud? And then we asked 5 specific questions about the characteristics of the cloud services that were being relied upon. Is it on-demand and self-service? Is it broad network access, resource pooling, rapid elasticity, and measured service? You can actually see the number of people who responded, I think yes and no, agreed or strongly agreed. And what we found was that only 22% of the teams that responded that they were using cloud were using all 5 capabilities, or had these 5 capabilities capable. So these 5 capabilities come from the NIST definition of cloud. And so so finding number 1 is only 1 out of 5 people who said they were doing cloud are using cloud correctly. I'm putting that in quotes. And secondly, is that those teams that were using all 5 characteristics were 23 times more likely to be elite performers. So I think it just shows that the real power of cloud is being massively underused, and that when you exploit all 5 capabilities, performance is substantially greater, 23 times more likely to be a high performer. Again, that has to resonate with things you've seen. Ben.
Yeah, well, and absolutely, Gene, and I think particularly how you guys point out doing cloud right, because there's obviously a lot of different ways to implement cloud, and and different ways of actually. I think you've seen a lot of companies completely fail at it in the past, and knowing that they're doing it right is important. I mean, one question I had for you was, how correlated do you think that the use of cloud is with this elite performance? Because you point that out here at the bottom here, that it's 23 times more likely. But does that seem to be almost a requirement to be in that elite top performing segment?
I'm not sure about a requirement, but I mean, I think it does say that the ability to enable developer productivity, the ability to be able to work independently, to be able to truly use the environment in a platform like where we have self-service capabilities, where you don't rely on people opening and having to work on tickets, right? I think those are characteristics that are highly conducive to using cloud as a solution for. So I wouldn't say it's a requirement, but I would say if you take a look at all the things that predict performance, cloud is a great way to get there.
It lowers the barrier to entry to doing it, I guess, is another way of saying it. Right?
Absolutely, right. And why build it when you can just use it as a service and use your credit card to get there.
Exactly.
Awesome. So here's another one that I thought was super interesting about open source software. Next slide. So we found that teams that use open source are 1.75 times more likely to be elite performers, and that teams also, the same teams are 1.5 times more likely to expand their open source usage in the future. So I think this is maybe just to back up a second. One of the great definitions I've heard in my career was this: the goal of science is to explain the most amount of observable phenomena with the fewest number of principles, confirm deeply held intuitions, and reveal surprising insights. And I think this is just another one of those findings that just do just that. We know that these days the majority of the software in production that we deliver is not software we wrote. Maybe 5 to 10% of the software is actually stuff that we wrote. The rest are coming through open source libraries. And I think what this shows is that the high performers, they're being very parsimonious about what developers should be working on, right? They shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. They should be using the best known technologies out there. And often that is very much in the open source community. Ben, any comments on that?
No, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, our team as well. I mean, we try to leverage the best practice in the industry as much as possible. And why reinvent the wheel when there's a lot of smart people out there that have already crossed the same bridge? It makes a lot of sense.
Brilliant. So on the next slide, slide 19. So one of the things that we found even in the earliest years of the study was that high performance could be found in every industry, and specifically, the objection we were trying to negate was that the only companies that were high performers were like the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Googles of the world, or it's the hot software startups like Sumo Logic. That if you were a bank, if you were a telco, if you were in a DoD large weapons program, right, high performance was not possible. And so I think that's a very convenient objection and excuse. But you could see even in the early years that the high-performing cluster could be found across all industry profiles. One of the things that Dr. Forsgren wanted to do this year was to very conclusively state that the high performers, that industry just did not matter. And she used a lot of incredible statistical techniques to actually show that high performers exist in both non-regulated and highly regulated industry, that in no industry, that industry is not that does not matter in the highest levels of statistical significance. So I think that was just a really neat finding, and something that I think has been very important for us over the years. Did I say already that? Okay, let me actually just say this is the 5th year of the State of DevOps report, and this is something that I have been so proud to be associated with, and this has been done in collaboration with Jez Humble, and the lead principal investigator on this is Dr. Nicole Forsgren. And so this is the amount of learnings that have come out of this has been just through the roof. The early years were done in partnership with Puppet, and this year was done in conjunction with Google Cloud. So sorry for missing that. That should have been the first thing that I said. Okay, on the next slide. Database. So I think this is interesting just because of all the areas in the application stack, application, database, operating system, networking, firewall. I think all of them have been revolutionized over the years using kind of infrastructure as code like patterns, except for the database. And so that means that the database has been one of the most petrifying and terrifying things to change, especially when it involves things like schema changes, because they're very global in nature. Even the firewall people have figured out how to use techniques like infrastructure as code, so that they can be better tested. And what we're finding is that those same principles and patterns can be applied in the database space, and you can get the same sort of radical improvements in outcomes. And speaking as someone who has done, I think, more than my desired levels of database schema changes, I can say this was a sigh of relief that help is finally here for the database people. Even relational databases. So at the heart of every data center is a database. That has not changed. And so this is actually great to have really substantiated in the State of DevOps report, finally. Slide 21. We've always known that testing is important, that testing is not just a job of some sort of external testing group, that developers must view automated testing as part of their daily work, that the more developers delegated or abdicated the quality assurance objectives, the worse the outcomes. In fact, what we really want is have developers not just work on application functionality, but also the testability. And we found that to be absolutely the case again this year, is that continuous testing extends automated testing and again positively contributes to software delivery and operations performance. So again, just further advancing long-held intuitions and beliefs. Slide 22 is about monitoring and observability. So one of the study objectives was to both look at monitoring as it has been classically defined and a new kind of take on monitoring that's been emerging called observability. And what we found was that teams with great monitoring were 1.3 times more likely to be an elite performer, and again positively contributed to SPO performance. A little fun stats fact is that monitoring and observability, we treated them as distinct, but they loaded together. And what I've learned over the years from Dr. Forsgren is that what this means is that it means that things load together when they are viewed as the same by the respondents. In other words, they may be indeed different. In fact, they did have a very different set of questions associated with them, but they both go up and down together and are not distinct. So looking ahead, one of our goals is to further drill into this and try to understand what is the difference between monitoring and observability, and be able to find very specific differences between them. Ben, I know this is of intense interest to you.
Well, Gene, I have a question for you on that. When you guys had defined the difference, as much as you did try to define a difference, what do you see as the major difference between monitoring and observability?
This is not my area of expertise. I'm going to see if I can find the questions for you right now. And why don't you go into your slides and let me see if I can dig up those answers.
Sure, absolutely. And one thing before you dig into that, there was a question from the audience about what it means to have a measured service. So I'm assuming that is actually referring to monitoring in terms of that NIST definition of cloud, right?
Say that again.
So there was a question from the audience about what do you mean by measured service? So back in the definition of cloud characteristics, is measured service basically monitoring of cloud systems?
Yeah, actually, you know what? SPO Performance is actually on slide 13. I think I accidentally skipped that. So if you go to slide 13, this is what we define as SPO Performance, software delivery and operational performance. So it's three specific sets of measurements. One on I guess what we call what is developers associated with. So this could include things like lead time, deployment frequency. There's software deployment, which adds in the change failure or change success rate and mean time to restore, and then service operations. So this is a new construct for this year, where we also added availability, which in hindsight makes total sense, right? It's you can be great at deploying quickly and frequently. You could be great at restoring service when bad things occur, and having great success in batting averages when doing deployments. But it's also important to have services up when customers expect it to be up, and so it's something that we were missing. And so, to what extent organizations are achieving all three axes of performance, that is what we're calling SPO performance. So
okay, got it. Okay, that makes a lot
sorry.
of sense.
So the high performers are 3.5 times more likely to have great availability, or the achievement of the availability objectives. So
Okay,
that is the answer.
Okay, got it. And and I think that's a really good segue here, because I think to me, that's been one of the most important things that have come out of the whole DevOps evolution, revolution, whatever you want to call it, is this idea of developers in particular, and the people writing and being responsible for innovating in code, that they're actually being held responsible, holding themselves responsible for uptime. That to me was, because when I started out early, before DevOps was a thing, that was one of the hardest things to kind of come to agreement on, is like, when you write code, are you thinking about how that's actually going to perform in production? Are you thinking about the availability? Are you actually trying to design availability into your product from the very beginning? And that seems to be continuing to be such an important thing. Are you actually thinking about that from step one, right? In particular, when we were talking about this, is internally, as I said, I was a product manager for years, and one of the ways that we would think about building a comprehensive monitoring strategy was to make sure that we had that observability, we had that view across all these different aspects of the service. Because I think when I started back in the early 2000s, it was like red light, green light, and that's what you seem to have to rely on. And that's just not good enough today. You can't actually get into this elite category, or even in the top categories, if you can't do a couple different things. And usually I've seen this divided into 4 categories: system performance, system security events, application performance, and application events. And one thing I point out too is as security is shifting left into this process, it becomes more important for to make sure that you have security events as part of this whole process, because a lot of times we get left out. Now, what typically has happened is that a lot of this has been spread across multiple different tools, across data silos, which is not really compatible with the DevOps philosophy. In the first part is that you have these teams that are collaborating together and working together. Why would you want to have your data siloed? And that's one of the reasons why we at Sumo Logic in particular, but we talk about something called machine data. But fundamentally is, are you actually putting the telemetry into your code? Are you actually leveraging the telemetry from your platforms and leveraging that across the board? So not just looking at time series metrics on what are the symptoms, but also looking at the root cause and logs and being able to use those together. So that's one of the things when we work with our customers, is now being able to think about how those go across these different categories. So can I go from looking at the SLOs, looking at the SLA measurements, those key customer visible measurements that would be in the application performance, and probably more than anything here, like things like latency, service uptime, and then being able to tie that to those key events that are happening that are happening in the code and in the platform. And one thing I'd say here too is that I think one of the biggest lessons I learned working with teams that actually had to manage their performance and their availability, and actually had to think of, and actually were on call, is that we actually made observability requirements, let's call it that. We put that in our epics as we created. We put together requirements. It wasn't just build this widget that does this for the customer. It was like, we'll measure it in this way, and this is how we expect for it to perform or fail. And to me, that was absolutely key to actually doing this right. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Gene, but that
Yeah,
was
yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, one of the most fascinating examples of what triggers kind of a transformation is was Facebook in 2008, and they had there's this famous story that said there was an ops meeting, about 15 people in the room. There's this rule that says you can only have a laptop open if there's a live site incident, and all 15 people had their laptops open. And so what did they do about it? They said that was when they put all dev managers and architects on pager rotation. And they found that within 6 months, suddenly site reliability went way up because it was the first time that developers had to deal with the downstream effects of decisions they made every day, right? And suddenly you saw the profound elevation and of priority in terms of how important monitoring and observability is. So, I just love that story because it shows, when you're on the hook and you're on call, right? Suddenly, observability monitoring is just as important as the features you're creating.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Awesome. Hey, can we do one question real quick?
Sure.
Ben? So Sunny asks, how do you secure the use of open source software? I think this is actually, well, let me snooze that for 60 seconds. So it's a great question. So what this diagram shows, this is one of my favorite tools that I use a lot. And this is called a structural equation model diagram. We affectionately call this the BFD, the big freaking diagram. And what this shows is that is how specific behaviors or practices predict performance. And so every time that you see an arrow, that actually shows a causal link, or maybe more precisely, it predicts, left predicts right. So all the behaviors on the left predict continuous delivery, or the success of continuous delivery. Continuous delivery in turn predicts culture and SPO performance, and deployment pain and fear. Also predicts negatively predicts burnout. And then SPO performance in turn predicts organizational performance. So everything that is in boldface and caps, those are new. There are new instruments in 2018. So to answer the question, like, how do you secure the use of open source software? That is such a great question, and it's so timely because I think it was just a couple of weeks ago where there was a malware found in a very popular NPM JavaScript library, the event stream library. Someone had actually, the maintainer actually just was tired of maintaining the library. Someone volunteered to take it over. It was turned over, and then that person planted malware into the library, specifically looking for like Bitcoin scraping stuff. so yeah, there's certainly risks in using open source software, and so clearly there has to be some sort of countermeasure, right? Is making sure that this open source software that we consume, is consistent and is something that we actually want to be consuming, and whether the licenses are consistent with what we want to be incorporating into our own software. So I think there are a whole bunch of technologies that help us do that, and it's also important that we also inherit all the vulnerabilities of all the open source software we consume. So the Apache Struts vulnerability is another example of that. So just another thing that we have to worry about as those of us who build and run software. And so the extent of which we achieve those objectives in the security domain also predict performance. You can't be available if you have an open a vulnerability that you can take down production on demand. So the next slide is more of this. So one of the other great surprises that came out of this was getting more insights on the culture and the leadership front. So we found that retrospectives drives climate for learning, which we know is important for the ability for organization to learn and respond to rapidly changing conditions. And retrospectives improve organizational culture. And so the instrument that we use and have used for many years is a Westrum organizational topology model. What Dr. Westrum discovered 15 years ago was that organizational culture was one of the top predictors of patient safety in healthcare organizations. And so he had this really great model where there's kind of three archetypal categories: pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. Yes, pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. So pathological organizations are those where we fear telling bad news. Messengers of bad news are shot. We don't seek novelty. We actively, try to squash it out. Bureaucratic cultures try to create a merciful culture, whereas generative cultures, we actively seek learning. We train people to tell bad news. These are the things that lead to, blameless postmortems, because we know that, if the problem were easy to solve, it would have been solved already. So, one of the reasons why we seek novelty. And then on the next slide,
Gene, before you go ahead, you reminded me of one thing when I read the Accelerate book and you guys told about those different stages. I think it was having flashbacks to previous jobs. So it really does explain what I think a lot of us have seen in our day-to-day jobs over the years, and it really helps explain a lot of what goes on in culture. I think that was great.
Yeah, right. It's you're not alone, Ben. And I think what's so great about these kind of topology, I think you can criticize saying that organizations aren't just pathologic, they're not just bureaucratic or generative, but the whole point of models like that is that to generate that sort of aha moment that says, oh, I can now recognize them from things I've seen in the past. They cease being abstract and instead become immediately recognizable.
Right.
So another element of the study this year was to really create additional insights around that. And so here's one that I just found very rewarding, that giving teams autonomy improves voice and trust. So voice is the notion that we are heard, right? When we have concerns, that people listen, that genuine concerns are acted upon. And trust is trust in leadership, trust in the system, the trust that the right things will happen. And those two things drive culture as measured by the Westrum model, which in turn drives organizational performance. So again, I just love these kind of words that help us kind of. What I love about academics is that they can speak with such precision about things that are often kind of nebulous, at least in my head, right? To be able to give them very specific definitions for very specific connotations and ideas. So voice and trust. And then there's one other element, which is autonomy. Autonomy improves voice and trust. Right. So this should resonate with anyone who's read the Dan Pink book about we want autonomy and mastery. Right, and these things actually do lead to great things, according to the study. All right, so let's. We're on the final stretch here. We have a couple last surprises that I think are super interesting. Slide 30 is misguided performers. So Dr. Forsgren, she was noticed something very interesting in the data. Is that we know that a consistent theme over the last 5 years is that high performers can simultaneously achieve speed and stability, right? You can be fast and also be available and stable. But there is this kind of category that is optimizing for caution. So in other words, you can spot them because they have a very low deployment frequency. They have very high lead times, maybe because they're doing a lot of testing, a lot behaviors that you would see in cautious organizations, and they have low deployment rates. But these are the organizations that also have these astoundingly long mean time to restore times, 1 to 6 months. So the text here, large batch changes add complexity, and no one thinks it will happen to them, but 5% of teams suffer these consequences. In other words, 5% of these teams have these kind of cautious characteristics, but these astoundingly long mean time to store time. So, one might react by saying, who has 1 to 6 months restoration times? And this actually, I think, happens a lot more often than we think. I mean, in the Phoenix project, after the big deployment failure, I mean, the point of sale systems were down for weeks, right? You can imagine teams were actually restoring data for weeks. I think for ERP systems. In fact, I ran to a friend. He was telling me about they're into week 4, where the data warehouse and the financial reporting systems technically they're up, but they're still trying to restore data. Because these things take a very, very long time. Healthcare.gov, right? Again, where we're looking at the systems might be up, but we're a long way from being in a standard operating mode. So I thought that was super interesting, right? Slow in this case and cautious might feel good, but these long restoration times, just clearly not a good place to be.
Hey, Gene, quick question for you on this, because I found just like on the one side the elites, this idea of misguided performers, but this is different than just a low performance. I mean, where is this coming from? Is this coming from is this just, trying to, use a waterfall method and kind of trying to keep that going forward? Or is this really just kind of a cultural thing that you think you guys are seeing, where there's just a culture of caution? I mean, what's really driving this, at least from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's, I like your, I like the way you're sort of connecting the dots there, and I'll just add more, right? It's this feeling that we'll be very methodical and rigorous, and that will be good enough, right? We'll
Right.
Slow and steady, right? Well, we're in the race, but in this case, what it means is that there's a bunch of changes happening. So imagine in this scenario, I have in my head a release manager who's responsible for 600 checklists, where everyone has to do something right in exactly the specified order. And if you missequence 2 steps, right, catastrophe, right? And suddenly you're looking at drop tables and the terabytes of missing data. And I think that's the kind of thing that kind of evokes. That's the idea that's evoked in my head, where it is an unsafe system, and instead of architecting safety into the system, we try to compensate by caution, checklists, and manual supervisory controls, as like an auditor would say. And that clearly, I think most of us have been in situations, or have had friends in situations where something goes wrong and catastrophe strikes.
You can't run away from your tech debt, right?
Right, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Good. Let's go to slide 32, the next slide after this. And outsourcing. I mean, I think this is a really interesting one, and I think it was very again satisfying. So let me just read it first, because I want to be careful about the wording here. Low performing teams were 3 times more likely to use functional outsourcing than elite teams. Elite teams rarely adopt functional outsourcing. And the misguided performers have the highest use of outsourcing of all groups. So the term, the specific term we're using here is functional outsourcing, where we're actually taking one piece of the value stream, whether it's development, QA, operations, security, and we put that outside the organization, right? That's the type of outsourcing we're talking about here. What we're specifically not talking about is like offshoring, where we might take the entire dev, QA, ops, security group and place them in some other geography, right? That's I think the common wisdom is that that's okay, right? Because they're functioning as a team with shared goals. What we're talking about here is now when you have a piece of the organization that is now outside. Piece of the value stream that's now outside the organization, and they don't communicate like a team. They often communicate like sovereign states do, right? Often with lawyers involved and account managers, and it's very difficult to have a sense of shared goals, under those conditions. So, super interesting, and I think there are still some industries that are notorious for practices where they have outsourcing dev to one outsourcer, QA to another, ops to yet another, and then if that weren't bad enough, you outsource security to yet an entirely different group, and then you shuffle them around every 5 years. So yeah, I think those are typically not great, don't lead to great outcomes, and the study validates that. So and you and I were having some conversations about this, Ben.
Yeah, no, I found this one, and you actually, I think, even to a large degree answer some of the questions that I had, because that whole thing you talk about, geographical distribution versus the functional outsourcing, and I can appreciate how you focus on the words there, because I mean, any company that's growing, and particularly in today's global economy, you're going to have distributed engineering teams, you're going to have distributed people. The point here seems to be you have to maintain the team structure. You gotta have these geographical performance functioning as cross-functional teams, not just okay, we have the user interface developers over here, our other type, our DBAs over here, that where you're keeping, because it's about breaking down the barriers, right?
Right, and where you find the biggest barriers is often when you cross organizational boundaries. And when you talk about functional outsourcing and extreme, in fact, I think this is by definition, right, is that you insert a profit motive, right, and that outsourcing group has to make a 5 to 7% profit or whatever or more. Suddenly you don't have spanning DevOps is hard enough, right? You insert a separate organization that has its own separate organizational goals. I think that does make it even harder.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So major takeaways on the next slide, and the next slide is year 5 of the State of DevOps report. These are such fun to do, and there's always some amazing learnings that come out of it. So the big points this year: cloud matters, that it's technical practices, architectural practices, and leadership. All of those are important. The functional outsourcing is, boy, that was a big one. And then, visiting kind of how we define the performance of a technology organization, and we're now defining it as SDO, software delivery and operations performance, because we threw in the availability objectives as well. So that on the next slide, the full report is available at this link, and my understanding is that the slides will be made available to everybody. And I also want to acknowledge everyone, my collaborators on the support on the next slide. Dr. Nicole Forsgren, the lead author on this, Jez Humble, who is a co-author of the DevOps Handbook and Accelerate, and myself. So looking forward to year 6. And Ben, it's been a pleasure doing this with you. And the next slide is thank you so much to you and Sumo Logic for helping make this research possible. So absolutely. With that, I turn it over to you.
Absolutely, and I'd say, Gene, it's been really great to be part of this, because I think to see something that we can support, that I see engineers walking around with the Accelerate book and reading the report, and I'm actually having conversations with people in our engineering teams about this, and I think that's really great to be able to support that type of work and research that is just so broadly helpful to the community. So I'm happy to be part of that.
So actually, just a real brief note. I mean, we actually first started interacting, I think, in 2012, right? Mm-hmm. Time flies. So 6 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And being there when the Phoenix project first came out, and I still recommend that to even our salespeople. I think it's such a great way to talk about that. So it's great to continue to work with you. So we had some great questions here that we can take a couple of minutes to go through, here at the end. So, one great question that came up a little bit earlier, and I was kind of saving it here, was about, how long it takes to go from low performer to elite performance. I'm sure that anyone who goes and reads the report or reads the book, will look at some of those things and be like, oh, I want to see my team move further up this scale. But I mean, what have you guys seen? Because you guys also work with companies to help them make this transition. So what have you seen in in the trenches for people to actually make those transitions?
Yeah, well, in fact, okay, let's go to slide 31. That's a great question. This is a J-curve transformation. So, I mean, in my experience, I've been running this conference called the DevOps Enterprise Summit for we're going into our 6th year now. That'll be in 2019. And it's really about large, complex organizations. So in the early years, it was no unicorns allowed, no Facebooks, Amazon, Netflix, and Googles. We want to hear just from this large, complex organizations. The most recognized brands in every industry vertical. And what's been amazing is that you see these organizations tell their stories, and we get to track them year over year. And I think my off-the-cuff answer is that in general, it's like takes 3 years. And specifically, they have a specific shape. It's kind of the famous J curve, where it's the y-axis here is enthusiasm, right? We feel good that we're embarking on this journey, but then it's like a lot of work, right? And in fact, the more tests you add, the more tests you have failing, right? The more problems you find, the more problems you have to fix, right? And that's got to come from someplace, right? And so that may not feel so good, but then you eventually do get better, right? And now you go from this vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. So that's kind of the punchline of the J curve. But whether you look at the birth of automated testing at Google to the astounding kind of creation of the Visual Studio Team services, to the transformation of Amazon, to whether it's Disney or Nordstrom or Nike or Capital One, right? I mean, in general, it takes about 3 years, right? To be able to have something that people are proudly showing off. So, of course, that's not a scientifically precise answer, but I would say that's what the anecdotes seem to suggest. And for anyone who is interested in what does the story sound like, just Google DevOps Enterprise videos on YouTube, and you have all those. We have over 280 videos online now. They're almost all experience reports, and I think they should give you a very visceral sense of what do these transformations feel like. What were the elements of the transformation, and you get a sense of how long it takes as well.
So, building off that, because you mentioned Google, and I mean, one thing that's always interested me, how do you see the discipline of site reliability engineering fit into all this? Because that seems to have kind of emerged from some of the DevOps practices. How do you see that kind of fitting in with the rest of this framework?
Yeah, so the quick answer is that we have not yet measured that in the State of DevOps report, but I suspect that may very well be coming in the next year or years ahead. And I think there's something about SRE that I think is really resonating with the ops community, and I think it's brilliant. I mean, I think it is the best embodiment of a self-balancing system, right? The whole notion of error budgeting, how do we sort of make sure that the high performers with great technical practices and great engineering, how do we allow them to go fast and yet also be able to curb the ones that aren't so great, and that we can actually slow them down to be able to shore up the technical practices and pay down technical debt. And I think it's just a great definition of what ops will look like in 10 years. So, just and again, anecdotally, I think there's something very much about SRE that is working and is being widely adopted across the industry. And you can see this in the presentation in DevOps Enterprise as well. So, I think Google did a phenomenal service to the industry by codifying that and putting books out about it and evangelizing that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, one thing I know that it was in the book, and I believe it was in the report a little bit as well. But I'm always interested to see how you guys are seeing management and leadership fit into this, because I mean, obviously, a big part of DevOps, and you talked about this, is about having a learning culture, about empowering the individual contributors and allowing ideas to bubble up, and not just top-down management, but obviously it's necessary to have that the management and the leadership actually being part of this in some way. I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting. We don't have. We should publish out the latest version of the full BFD. And
Mm-hmm.
what the full BFD shows is to the left, at the very left is transformational leadership. And this is a finding that came out 2017. So I guess that was last year, and it showed that there are 5 domains that predicted an amplified performance. It was vision, right? To what extent does leadership understand the vision of the organization and can get their teams in front of it, not just to be relevant, but to help with the achievement of the biggest challenges of the organization? Intellectual stimulation. To what extent does the leader challenge basic assumptions about doing work? Just because we did it for the last 20 years the same way doesn't mean that we have to do it the same way today, right? Third is inspirational communication, to what extent can they create excitement and overcome fears about this new way of working? Supportive communications, personal recognition. So those 5 things, radically, improves outcomes. Teams, the bottom half of transformational leadership characteristics, or a bottom third, where only 1/2 is likely to be high performers. So, I think that gave another, it's just another one of those things where it when you see it, and this gives words to things that we recognize. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one last question for you to wrap up before we go to the end is that you gave one prediction that you thought we'd maybe see some site reliability engineering measurements in there. Anything else that you think we might see in the report next year?
yeah, I have I can share some of my own aspirations. Again, I think there's this. It's always fun to sort of lobby for these ideas. It is a long process, and there's only a finite number of questions that can fit in. But I continue to want to find ammunition that shows that being a high performer is something that every business leader should care about. And so whether that is, and it's still trying to figure out what is it, what is it that if they would see would be the most compelling thing that would help them support DevOps journeys. So, I don't know what that is, but I think that is really, I think the quest is increasingly the technology community believes in this. And the question is, how do we get business leadership fully on board so that they can help overcome obstacles?
Absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good note to leave on, because that's a lot of what you guys are about, is giving the the people that believe in this the tools to get their organizations on board and being able to make these changes, and I think that's great. Well, Gene, I really enjoyed doing this with you, and one thing before we head out is the last event that you and I did together. I talked about this as well. One of the joys I've had recently is I love talking to people like Gene and others in the space about what what they're learning and what the big ideas out there. So I encourage all of those you listening to go check out the podcast that I've started that's supported by Sumo Logic, called Masters of Data. And one of the reasons why this came to mind, you can go to mastersofdata.com to check it out, get on any platform that you use. And one of the reasons why I think you definitely be interested in this is, first of all, I got the great chance to interview Jez and Nicole, who are just absolutely fun to talk to. And we actually talked about Accelerate, the book. This was we talked before the report came out, so this is a little earlier this year, and it was a really great forum just to explore how they thought about it, and just really, Nicole is very passionate about this stuff, and it was really great to get through that. And then as well, when we interview a lot of other really interesting people, both people from the industry like Unily here, who actually started the office for Samsung here in the Silicon Valley when they didn't have a presence, and built that up, and just hear how he's thinking about innovation industry. And then fun people like Kathy there, who, the best book title ever, with all due to accelerate weapons of mass destruction. That's such a great title. But a lot of fun people to check out on there, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. And I think with that, thanks everybody for joining. And again, Gene, this is always fun to do things with you. I appreciate you doing this with us.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Ben.
All right, guys, what great presentation. I do want to remind the audience real quick before we close things out that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. As I said at the top of the hour, we'll be sending out an email this afternoon that includes a link that you can access the webinar on demand. The webinar is actually also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always check there for it. And while you're there, please check out the other webinars that we have both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. Yes, so guys, Ben and Jean, thank you both so much for giving such a great presentation. And I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon signing off. Have a great day, everybody.